A coast defense mortar was a massive weapon of 12-inch caliber emplaced during the 1890s and early 20th century to defend U.S. harbors from seaborne attack. In 1886, when the Endicott Board set forth its plan for upgrading the coast defenses of the United States, it relied primarily on mortars, not guns, to defend American harbors. Over the years, provision was made for fortifications that would mount them 476 of these weapons, although not all of these tubes were installed. 91 of these weapons were remounted as railway artillery in 1919, but this was too late to see action in World War I. The railway mortars were only deployed in small quantities, and none overseas. The fixed mortars in the Philippines saw action in the Japanese invasion in World War II. All of the fixed mortars in the United States were scrapped by 1944 as new weapons replaced them, and the railway mortars were scrapped after the war. Today, the only remaining mortars of this type in the 50 states are 4 at Battery Laidley, part of Fort DeSoto near St. Petersburg, Florida. But the remains of coast defense mortar emplacements can be seen at many former coast artillery forts across the United States and its former territories. Additional 12-inch mortars and other large-caliber weapons remain in the Philippines. The weapons. The 1890 M1 12-inch mortar was one of the most powerful coast artillery pieces of its era, and was the most common type emplaced to guard U.S. harbors. This mortar and other models, the M1886, M1908, and M1912, usually fired deck-piercing shells. These weighed from 700 to 1,046 pounds and had heavy, hardened steel caps designed to pierce a ship's deck armor before the shell exploded. These mortars, firing the half-ton shells at an elevation of 45 degrees, had a range of 12,019 yards. The deck-piercing shells were usually the ammunition of choice, because even the heaviest battleships of the 1890 to 1920 period were relatively lightly armored on the tops of the main decks, so a plunging half-ton shell could inflict crippling damage on one of them. Early on, coast defense mortars were also supplied with Sickle torpedo shells, weighing 800 or 1,000 pounds. These were thin-walled shells roughly 5 feet in length that carried explosive charges of about 130 pounds and were meant to detonate upon contact with the deck of a ship, scattering fragments among the crew. The M1890 M1 mortar was most often installed on an M1896 carriage. The mortar and its carriage weighed a total of 78.5 tons. The carriage was geared to enable it to be turned by means of a traversing crank with 2 handles located on the right side of the piece. A ring marked in degrees of azimuth ran around the mortar, just outside the inner steel circle or racer that carried the carriage, and a soldier read a pointer on the racer to aim the mortar in direction. The tube was raised or lowered by twin-geared wheels with long spokes that were located on either side of the carriage. The breech could be rapidly depressed to an almost level position for loading and then be quickly elevated for firing. Other carriages included the M1891 and M1908. In addition to the elevation of its tube, the factor that determined the mortar's range was the size of the powder charge that was loaded into its breech following the shell. The desired range for the mortar was specified in terms of zones. The smallest zone was Zone 1, and the largest was Zone 9. with the so-called aliquot charge. Up to 9 equal-size, disc-shaped bags of powder thick and containing 6.3 pounds of powder could be attached to a 10th bag by means of cloth binding straps that were sewn to the base bag. Often the base bag was painted red, indicating that the powder assembly was to be loaded into the breech red end last, so that it bumped up against the closing breech block. The red base bag also contained a small charge of black powder as an igniter. When the breech was closed, a detonator was inserted through the breech block and contacted the igniter, ready to set off the full powder charge. The mortar could be fired in one of two ways, either electrically or manually, and each method had its own type of detonator. Electrical firing required first that the crew attach a wire to the electrical detonator, which protruded from the breech block. Second, the crew had to connect the firing cable coming out of the pit floor to the carriage of the individual mortar out in the pit. Third, the circuit switch leading to the individual mortar had to be thrown into the closed position. Finally, the firing magneto, which was mounted on a special issue, often on the wall of the pit near the data booth, had to be cranked up and then released, sending the firing current out to the pit. Depending on the switch settings, the mortars in a given pit could be fired one at a time or all together. Lanyard firing had fewer fail-safe features, and was accomplished by a crewman who stood well behind the breech and pulled smartly on the lanyard to fire the individual mortar. Emplacement design history. The earliest coast defense mortar batteries of the modern era were designed as so-called Abbott quads, named for Gen. Henry Larcom Abbott, the Army engineer who invented the design. Abbott quads were rectangular configurations of 4 rectangular mortar pits, with each pit designed to mount 4 of the huge mortars. A plan for an Abbott quad mortar battery is shown at left. The idea behind the Abbott quad was to have all 16 mortars in the 4 pits fire at once, producing a shotgun-like salvo of plunging shells optimally dispersed to destroy an enemy ship. It was argued that targeting each mortar individually would not produce many more hits than salvo firing, since early fire control procedures and equipment were often error-prone. Furthermore, proponents of salvo firing pointed out that it made for easier command and control, since all mortars in all pits of a battery could be given the same firing data. Early battery designs often contained one central firing room from which cables ran out to the various mortar pits, enabling electrical firing of all weapons simultaneously. However, the early Abbott quad designs featured very small mortar pits. Often, 4 mortars were mounted in a pit that was only about 40 by 50 feet in size. 4 circular areas about 18 feet in diameter would fit into one of these early pits, producing a very crowded situation. A photo of such an early, crowded pit is shown at left. When a mortar battery was fully manned, a formal guidelines called for a pit containing just 2 mortars to be manned by a pit commander, 2 mortar squads of 17 enlisted men each, and an ammunition squad of 16 enlisted men. One of the last versions of the manual for the 12-inch mortar gives details on how it was to be crewed and fired. After about 1905, reliance on the Abbott quad design declined. Some artillery officers argued strongly that salvo firing was inherently wasteful, and that a much better hit ratio could be achieved by aiming each mortar individually against a specified target. They also argued that the smaller, cramped mortar pits of the early Abbott quad battery designs were simply too crowded for efficient operations. With with mortar crews for different tubes constantly getting in each other's way. As fire control methods improved and the network of base end stations was extended, from about 1905 on, individual aiming of mortars could be more accurate. At the same time, designs for new pits often specified only 2 mortars per pit, and many forts constructed the mortar pits side by side. Experience showed the time to reload 4 tightly packed mortars in a pit was more than twice the time to reload 2 mortars in a pit. As a result, many 4 mortar pits were depopulated, and some of the tubes were sent away to equip newer batteries. The Abbott Quad designs passed from favor. Firing the mortars. The Coast Defense Study Group has found and posted this unique film clip that dates from around 1915 and shows a firing drill on the 12-inch mortars of Battery Howe, part of the harbor defenses of San Francisco. Although the battery shown is a linear one, the firing drill is similar to what would have taken place in a square or rectangular pit at Fort Banks. The film clip clearly illustrates how congested one of the old-style pits would have become if used to fire 4 mortars simultaneously or nearly so. The film shows the heavy shells being wheeled up to the breeches of the mortars and being rammed home, the powder bags being tossed into the breeches after them, a crew clearing the immediate area while the chief of the breach raises his arm to indicate ready to fire, and the mortars being fired electrically. The tubes are then depressed. Crewmen rush back in to swab out the tubes. The tubes are elevated, and crewmen back off. Firing occurs, and the process repeats itself. The shock wave from firing just one of these huge mortars, particularly if it was fired within one of the smaller, old-style pits, was often so strong that it destroyed sensitive equipment mounted near the pit, knocked doors off of nearby magazines and barracks buildings, and broke windows in neighborhoods that were near the mortar batteries. The thundering crash of 4 of these mortars being fired simultaneously in a pit must have been overwhelming. Fire control. The images here show another feature of the mortar pits, the data booth. Personnel in this small space with its taped viewing slits received the coordinates that had been calculated via plotting board by the battery's range unit as the firing coordinates for the mortars in order for them to hit the targets. These booths were either small, freestanding structures about 10 feet square and 7 feet tall, or were built into one of the walls of the mortar pit itself. The reconstructed data board in the photo at left hangs off the side of the data booth and is used to post the firing coordinates for mortars number 3 and number 4 in its pit. The zone number posted on the board refers to the size of the powder charge to be loaded for the coming shot. The top photo at right shows a decomposed set of slats that could have firing data chalked onto them and then be slid out of the data booth so they could be seen by the mortar crews in the pit. Since crews of the mortars could not see the targets, they were especially dependent on the overall fire control system, with its base end stations and plotting room, to locate and pinpoint targets for them to hit. Railway mortars. After the American entry into World War I on 6 April 1917, the U.S. Army considered converting coast artillery weapons to railway mounts for use on the Western Front. Railway guns were in use by all the major belligerents in the war by that time. Among the weapons that could be spared from fixed defenses were 150 12-inch mortars, removed from 4 mortar pits as above. Contracts were let for mounting 91 mortars on railway carriages known as the M1918 carriage. A hydro-pneumatic recuperator and outriggers allowed for all-around fire from the railway mounting, which weighed 88 tons. 45 railway mortar carriages were completed by the Morgan Engineering Company of Alliance, Ohio by 7 April 1919. All 91 contracted mortars were eventually mounted. The following footnoted article shows the firing of an M1890 mortar on the railway mounting, since the mounting permitted all-around fire and thus tracking of a moving target. The 12-inch railway mortar was retained after World War I for future coast defense use. The Army conducted tests with railway mortars in the 1930s. Some of the railway mortars were assigned to Battery C, 52nd Railway Artillery Battalion, and tested at the Sandy Hook Proving Ground at Fort Hancock, New Jersey, and also at Fort in Miles, Delaware. During World War II, a battery of 4 railway mortars was among the temporary harbor defenses of Grays Harbor, Washington, and emplacements for an additional battery at Cape George, Washington were constructed but never armed. Combat service. Probably the only U.S. 12-inch mortars to see action were those in the Philippines in 1942, particularly Battery Way and Battery Geary on Corregidor. These batteries totaled 12 mortars and were used in the fight against the Japanese invasion. However, as with other U.S. pre-1922 fortifications, the open-top emplacement design left the mortars open to air and high-angle artillery attack. They also had mostly armor-piercing ammunition which would penetrate into the ground before exploding and therefore was less effective than high-explosive ammunition against ground forces. Other 12-inch mortars were Battery Cola on Carabao Island, which was used for ineffectual counter-battery fire against the Japanese Kondo Detachment artillery on the southern shore of Manila Bay, and Battery Craig Hill on Caballo Island, which fired at targets generated locally and from Corregidor. Battery Craig Hill was manned by naval personnel from the gunboat Mindanao. All forts were surrendered on 6 May 1942 along with Corregidor. 10 mortars remain at Batteries Way and Geary while 4 mortars remain at Fort Hughes as of 2014. Surviving examples. 19 12-inch mortars survive mostly in the Philippines, with 4 at Fort De Soto on Mullet Key near St. Petersburg, Florida. 4 mortars M1890Mi on M1896Mi carriages at Battery Way, Fort Mills, Corregidor, Philippines. 2 mortars M1890Mi on M1896Mi carriages at Battery Geary Pite, Fort Mills, Corregidor, Philippines. 4 mortars M1908 on M1908 carriages at Battery Geary Pit B, Fort Mills, Corregidor, Philippines. 4 mortars M1912 on M1896Mi carriages at Battery Craig Hill Pits A and B, Fort Hughes, Caballo Island, Philippines. 4 mortars M1890Mi on M1896Mi carriages at Battery Laidley Pits A and B, Fort De Soto, Mullet Key, Florida. 1 mortar M1911 without carriage at the Visitor Center, Fort Wadsworth, Staten Island, New York.